All right, gentlemen, at long last, we've entered the final straightaway, the final lecture of the year. And here we go, the Ronald Reagan years. And yes, that is Ronald Reagan chuckling. I don't know where at, but I figured what the heck. I tell a lot of jokes about Ronald Reagan, just because I know, first of all, a lot of older white Americans absolutely adore Ronald Reagan, and for good reason. I think Ronald Reagan was a pretty good president. I don't have a Reagan tattoo. I don't think he deserves to be on Mount Rushmore or anything like that. I think Ronald Reagan was an incredibly effective president, but he was an incredibly misunderstood president in the sense of, everybody who champions him as the great conservative don't understand. He was conservative, but he also met the Democrats halfway. That's why I think he was a really good president. The man knew when he could kind of drive a hard bargain, and the man knew when he needed to kind of reach across the aisle and shake hands. I really feel like the Ronald Reagan years. The more I study American history and American politics, I feel like the Ronald Reagan years were not the last, but some of the last years where Democrats and Republicans were actually friendly to one another. In D.C., right? Ronald Reagan had a well-known cordial relationship with the House minority or Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, who was a Democrat, right? Um, and so he's a guy that gets praised for being a conservative and all this stuff. I look at him as not only a very strong conservative president, but a very strong president that he understood how to work with the other side. That America is not a dictatorship of which party has control of the White House, and maybe the Senate or Congress, but there's give and take. He's a very effective leader. Now let's talk about Ronnie Reagan. Oh, and by the way, this is actually the lecture where I would play Born in the USA, and I bring it up because Ronald Reagan wanted to use this song in his campaign in 1984. You see, this song came out in 1984. It was a bestseller, number one hit. It's considered one of the top 500 rock songs of all time, all that stuff, even today. And of course, most people think of the refrain and they're like, yeah, America, it's pro America. No, the song is not pro America. The song is an indictment of America's treatment of our Vietnam veterans. If you actually read the words to the song and you think about it, it's talking about what happened to the men who went to Vietnam, both in Vietnam and when they got back. It is not a pro American song. And Bruce Springsteen is a registered Democrat. And so when Ronald Reagan's campaign called Bruce Springsteen's manager about using the song, they were like, no. But anyhow, let's look at Ronald Reagan. Um, Ronald Reagan grew up in a small town in Illinois, graduated from small Eureka College in Illinois in 1932. He was a sports broadcaster for an Iowa radio station in 1937. He took a screen test and got a job for a movie studio in Hollywood. Went to Hollywood over the next 25 or so years. He worked in Hollywood. He was in 50 films, over 50 films. Now, he wasn't a star, okay? He wasn't George Clooney or anything like that. I don't even know if he was really the headliner in any film he was in per se. He was a supporting actor. He did a lot of film work, but he was never like a mega star. I will say that while he was in Hollywood, he eventually became the head of the Screen Actors Guild, which is the union for actors. In 1947, he became the head of that. Unfortunately, he had to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. You remember that from the Cold War, I hope. He had to testify before HUAC about communists in Hollywood. And he had to honestly answer, yeah, there are communist actors and directors, etc. There are communists in Hollywood. Ronald Reagan had been a Democrat as a young man and supported FDR's New Deal. But it was his experience with the whole investigation, communism, unions, etc., that began his transition to conservatism. But that's not what made him a conservative, okay? What made him a conservative, he liked to tell people, was his experience working for GE. So in 1954, Ronald Reagan got a job as the host of the General Electric Theater. So basically, GE sponsored, right, this program, and Ronald Reagan was the host. Well, as part of his contract for this gig, he had to go to GE facilities and give like motivational speeches or talks, right? And obviously, when he was there, he would, talk to the workers and eat lunch with them and stuff. And Ronald Reagan said that the stories he heard from those workers in the mid late 50s, um, about high taxes and government regulations and all the red tape and the ways their life was being negatively affected by government regulation and government intervention, that is what made him a conservative. It was a combination of his experience with communists in Hollywood in the 40s in the Red Scare, and then his experience with working Americans at General Electric in the 50s that transitioned him to being a conservative. In 1964, he actually was asked to give a speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater at the Republican National Convention. And he did, and his speech was incredible. So by 1964, Ronald Reagan is speaking at the Republican National Convention. Right? He went from, in his younger days, a Democrat who voted for FDR and the New Deal to, I'm not going to say middle-aged, but, into his adulthood, he was a respected conservative speaker who championed Barry Goldwater's campaign in 64. Now, as we all know, Barry Goldwater got creamed, but Ronald Reagan impressed a lot of wealthy California entrepreneurs, and they convinced Ronald Reagan to run for governor, and they helped finance his campaign, and in 1966, he won. Ronald Reagan became the governor of California. He won re-election in 1970. He actually made a challenge against Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination in 1976. He was really the only challenger to Gerald Ford, and I want to explain. Gerald Ford was the sitting Republican president. I mean, this would be like somebody really challenging Donald Trump for the nomination this year, right? You don't challenge a sitting president. It's just not how you do things. But Ronald Reagan challenged Jerry Ford. Matter of fact, the Republican convention of 76, if I remember correctly, was the last convention where we did not have a clear nominee before the convention. It was the last convention where the nominee was truly decided at the convention. In 1980, though, he won his party's nomination for the presidency. He was the Republican candidate in 1980. His 1980 campaign appealed to Americans who felt that America's economy was, stagnant and had not been improved under Democratic leadership, that America was becoming weak in the eyes of the world, and specifically the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan promised that he would cut taxes and increase defense spending. He told conservatives he would get a constitutional amendment to ban abortion. Ronald Reagan had a lead, but it wasn't a walk-off home run lead. It was fairly close, honestly. Poll showed. And then there was a debate a couple weeks before the election, right? And I usually show this in class. And Ronald Reagan, it gets to the end of the debate, and it's, gentlemen, you have 3 minutes to make your closing statement or whatever. And Ronald Reagan famously looked into the camera and he said, when you go to vote, ask yourself, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And he rattled off a bunch of things, right? Are you able to pay your bills? Or, is the number of unemployed Americans higher or lower? And then he gave a stat about if the average if the number of unemployed Americans lined up, it would stretch from LA to New York or something like that. Has the rate of inflation gone down? Do you think America is respected internationally? Do you think America is as strong in it? He went through all these things and he said, if you think America is better off, then obviously vote for Jimmy Carter. But if not, maybe we need a change. We need to turn America loose. I'm paraphrasing. That won him the election. That took his slim lead to a resounding lead. I mean, that literally put him over the top. And on election day, Ronald Reagan did very well. As you can see, Ronald Reagan won 489 electoral votes, crushing Jimmy Carter, who only brought home, DC's 3 votes, Rhode Island's 4, Maryland's 10, West Virginia's 6, Minnesota's 10, and his home state of Georgia's 12. And don't forget Hawaii, the powerhouse of four. Otherwise, America went Ronald Reagan. Popular vote 51%. Also, for the first time since 1954, the Republicans gained control of the United States Senate. So Ronald Reagan took it to the House, and Republicans in general took it to the House. By the way, I want to point out Ronald Reagan's great advantage as a politician was public speaking. It was debates. That's what he did for a living, guys. He was a radio broadcaster. He was an actor. He spent 30 years of his life behind a microphone or in front of a camera. The man is a public speaking presentation machine, right? And so he's going to clobber any opponent that wants to take him on a stage like that. All right, so, county by county, right? And if you're curious, all of Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati voted Ronald Reagan for once. For once, this whole area voted all the same way. There you go. We had to wait till the end of the year to get that. Now, so Ronald Reagan believed the first thing he's got to do is fix the economy, right? He's got to fix the economy. I mean, that's been the overarching issue now since, Richard Nixon was president. It plagued Nixon, it plagued Ford, it plagued Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan felt he's got to answer that. And he talked in his inaugural address about how he wanted to do this. He said, "We have every right to dream heroic dreams. You can see heroes every day going in and out of factory gates. Others, a handful in number, produce enough food to feed all of us. You meet heroes across a counter. They are the entrepreneurs with faith in themselves and faith in an idea who create new jobs, new wealth, and opportunity. Their patriotism is quiet but deep. Their values sustain our national life." He also said in that same inaugural address that in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. So Ronald Reagan feels that he is going to tackle some of these problems in a new and interesting way. He said, look, we've got high unemployment and high inflation. We've got stagflation, right? Stagflation, which we've talked about. High unemployment, high inflation. Nobody's sure what to do. Now, most economists said, obviously, government spending will cure unemployment, but it will increase inflation. They weren't exactly sure what to do. There were two competing schools of thought, okay? One group were known as monetarists. Monetarists argued that inflation was caused by too much money in circulation. All right, here, we'll get them. Monetarists. Too much money. If there's too much money, what do you do? What do? You raise interest rates, right? You make it harder to borrow money or more expensive to borrow money. Therefore, people will borrow less money. All right? Another group believed in supply-side economics. Supply-side economics is not a new idea. We learned about supply-side economics in our section on the 1920s. Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon, who argued that the economy was weak because taxes are too high, right? Excuse me. Now, you got two schools of economic thought that Ronald Reagan is dealing with, right? He's got two groups of advisors. One group says there's too much money. Another group says taxes are too high. And by the way, if you lower taxes, you create more money, right? Because people have more money in their pocket. Supply-side economists argued, though, that taxes are so high they took money away from investors. And if taxes were cut, they would use their money to, again, create new investments, new job opportunities. That would cure, unemployment, etc. And so Ronald Reagan decided he would actually combine the two. Because he said, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to balance the two. Okay? I'm going to cut taxes. Right? I will cut taxes. And that will put more money in the pockets of most Americans and allow them to buy goods. But we will also raise the interest rate. We will get the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates high, and we'll have massive tax cuts, right? And that will kind of offset, right? We'll lower taxes so people do have more money to spend, but we're going to limit how much money they're able to get their hands on by keeping the interest rates high. Now, Ronald Reagan liked to call it Reaganomics, okay? Opponents called it trickle-down economics, and some people called it voodoo economics. Ronald Reagan argued that yes, who's going to benefit the most from his tax cuts? The wealthy and the corporations. But the benefits would trickle down to you and I, the average American, or at least I, the average American, right? That yes, companies are suddenly going to make massive profits, but you know what they're going to do? They're going to hire more workers because as they make money, they're going to expand facilities and production, and they're going to put people to work who weren't at work. And maybe some of us who still have our jobs are actually going to get pay raises for the first time in a long time, or incentives or bonuses or whatever. So the benefits will trickle down. Ronald Reagan made a bunch of promises with conservative Democrats in the House and with moderate Republicans in the Senate, and he got it passed. He got a 25% tax cut passed. Massive tax reform, right? I mean, massive tax cut, 25%. You know, in 2016, 2017, Donald Trump and friends were talking, oh, we'll cut it 5%. We'll cut it 25%. Now, you have to remember, when you cut taxes, you cut government income. Forever, maybe not, but at least in the short run. We've talked about trickle down, we've talked about supply side economics. We talked about in the 1920s. When you cut the tax rate, you are, at least in the short term, going to cut government income. There's no way around that. There's no way that there will be enough economic growth to generate enough tax revenue to make up that difference in the first year or two, right? So if you're going to have fewer tax income, or less tax income, I guess I should say, you're going to have what's called a budget deficit. The government's going to spend more money than it makes, right? Ronald Reagan, of course, doesn't want to rack up a big deficit or debt. That's not a conservative way of approaching things. And so he proposed massive spending cuts on all sorts of social programs: welfare, food stamps, school lunch programs, Medicare, student loan, housing subsidies, unemployment benefits, all of them, right? Now, it took a lot of fighting with Congress, but he got a lot of these things passed. Ronald Reagan, though, realized that he would never be able to balance the budget for a couple of reasons. One, he could not get enough cuts through Congress to balance the budget. But number two, you're never going to get enough cut if you don't cut the biggest piece of the pie, which was defense spending. Ronald Reagan had ran on a promise that he was going to make America strong and stand up to the Soviet Union. He talked about a 600-ship Navy and all this other stuff. And America started spending money left and right on defense spending. Defense spending was the biggest piece of our budget under Ronald Reagan. So really quickly, I wanted to look it up. Defense spending in 1982 as part of the federal budget, roughly $222 billion. That is out of a total of $746 billion spent. So defense spending accounted for over 1/4 of America's spending in 1982. 1983, defense spending was $247 billion out of a total spent of $808 billion. Again, over a quarter of the budget. 1984, $269 billion out of an $852 billion spent. Again, well over a quarter. My point is, you can't balance the budget if you won't cut defense spending. It's the biggest piece of the pie, guys. You can't make it all add up if you're going to take the humongous, chunk of the pie and you refuse to change it, right? And so Ronald Reagan eventually accepted a deficit. He attempted to cut spending where he could, but he eventually accepted that he would never be able to successfully balance the budget, and he accepted a high deficit as the price for getting his plan through Congress. And for those of you who don't like America's debt, you can thank Ronald Reagan for starting it. I am not blaming it entirely on Ronald Reagan, but he started us on a path that's awful hard to correct. And before you all thank Bill Clinton for correcting it, Bill Clinton reaped the reward for reduced defense spending because the Cold War ended and all that spending was finally ended here. Okay? I used to give Bill Clinton all kinds of props for balancing the budget, but the more research I've done over the years, the more I realized Bill Clinton was the beneficiary of the end of the Cold War roughly 7 years before he became president. And that allowed him, because the budget is kind of created, and some items last longer than others. And some of these defense spending measures, even though the Cold War ended here, kind of, it's not like you can just shut it down right away, right? So some of those programs didn't really taper off till here, right? But anyhow, Ronald Reagan took the government debt from 2 trillion up to 4 trillion. He doubled it. Like, I know everybody screams and hollers about Obama and this person and that person, and yes, Mr. Obama did his share of debt increase. But guess what? Republican and Democratic presidents both played their part. And Ronald Reagan actually started us on the track that we roughly maintained up until the last year that George W. Bush was president, if you look at it. I took this chart, um, and if you kind of draw a line from the first year of Ronald Reagan's presidency to the last year of his presidency, excuse me, if you draw a line from the first year of his presidency to the last year of George H.W. Bush, you'll notice that the first few years of the Clinton administration run identically through there. Um, and then you will see that even a few years of George W. Bush kind of keep pace with it, right? And then, of course, all bets are off. But so America started on the road of massive debt under the leadership of Ronald Reagan, which is not a conservative value. But anyhow, sometimes you got to make compromises, right? And that goes back to what I said. Before you call him Mr. Conservative, you racked up the debt, sir. You racked up the debt. All right? You told everyone we got cash back and we had a platinum card, right? And everybody took that for real. And there's no going back. Anyhow, okay. Oh, here you go. My favorite one, too. If you want to look at increase in billions of dollars to the national debt, all of his spending, all of his New Deal programs, and World War II, FDR only added $153 billion to the debt. That's impressive, right? More bang for your buck. Dwight Eisenhower cut the debt, or excuse me, I shouldn't say cut. He added 31. He only added $31 billion in his 8 years as president, right? That's pretty impressive. John F. Kennedy was only there 3 years, added 20 billion. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society basically added 58 billion. You can see, and I mean, that's the thing, everybody looked at Jimmy Carter, and in 4 years, Jimmy Carter added more to the debt basically than Gerald Ford had done in his couple of years. But in a full term as president, Jimmy Carter had added more to the debt than any president before him. Any president. That's including, the 8 years of Eisenhower, all the years of Roosevelt, right? That's why people freaked out. And then Ronald Reagan came along, and Ronald Reagan took Jimmy Carter's number and crushed it. And I know some are like, Ronald Reagan was president twice as long. All right, divide that by 2. He still crushes Jimmy Carter, right? And this guy was only president for 4 years. I mean, you can see where we just go to a whole new level of spending under Ronald Reagan. But anyhow, not to belabor. Now, Ronald Reagan, though, also believed that one of the problems facing America was too many regulations, right? His first act as president, his very first act as president, was to sign an executive order eliminating price controls on oil and gasoline. He said, I'm going to deregulate the oil industry once and for all. No windfall profits taxes, none of that garbage, right? When Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, this is where oil prices stood. Well, in their day here, but to account for $2008, which are closer to our money, here you go, right? Oil was $90 a barrel roughly. He said it's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. We can take that down. How can we take it down? We can turn American oil companies loose. Critics argue, if you take the rules off, the companies will go, they'll price gouge. They'll go hog wild. Look what happened. Prices fell. Throughout the Reagan presidency, prices fell. Okay? Falling energy prices mean you have more money in your pocket and you can spend it elsewhere. You don't spend every dollar you own filling up your car. You don't spend every dollar that you earn heating your home. You don't spend every dollar in your pocket on, paying for fuel costs and energy costs and all the built-in costs that oil brings with it, right? He did this with other things. He had the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration reduce the demand on airbags and fuel-efficient cars. I have to take a moment to explain this, okay? When you have a law that requires airbags in cars, the theory is we're going to make the auto manufacturers make the cars safer. Airbags aren't free. Airbags are an expense that a manufacturer has to pay for to put in your car. How do they pay for that? They simply charge you more for the car. I am all about fuel efficient vehicles, right? I think fuel efficient vehicles are a good thing. Don't get me wrong. But I'm not foolish enough to believe that fuel efficient cars are without cost. I pay for fuel efficient cars. General Motors doesn't pay for those, or Ford, or whoever. Yes, they pay for all the research and development to design a more fuel efficient vehicle. And as soon as they design one, they sell them to us at a higher price than the older cars, right? If you look at it, all those fancy new cars that are more fuel efficient or hybrids or battery or whatever are more expensive than the older, less efficient gas cars. And of course, they argue, well, you're going to save the money in the long run. That is inconsequential to the auto manufacturer. They don't care what you spend on gas. What they care about is what you spend on the car, right? Think about it. That doesn't affect them long term. Your gas consumption is not their problem. Their problem is how much you pay for the car that they researched and developed. And so they pass it on. And so, Ronald Reagan pointed out, if we want to drop the cost to the consumer, we need to drop the cost to the manufacturer. We need to drop research and development costs, um, and get rid of some of these regulations that are forcing manufacturers to do things against their will and maybe against the will of the consumer. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, they began to deregulate cable television. Jimmy Carter had begun deregulating the airline industry, and Ronald Reagan continued that process. And it opened the door to more airline companies and cheaper fares, and airline travel actually became cheaper. Amazingly, when we took away the government regulations, everything got a little bit cheaper, right? Not everything. That's an overstatement. I apologize. But a lot of things got cheaper. Now, Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, Mr. James Watt, he increased the amount of public lands that could be used for oil drilling, mining, logging. It took regulations off of, what it would involve, drilling off the Gulf Coast and, off Prudhoe Bay in Alaska and all this stuff. Now, a lot of environmentalists in the EPA didn't like it, but costs did fall. Now, I'm not to say that there weren't some negatives. I'm not saying this is all positive. I'm not saying that this was utopia. But by and large, what was most concerning to most Americans, which were costs and expenses, began to fall. And the economy began to recover. By 1983, the economy began to turn around. And by 1984, the United States entered the biggest economic expansion that it would face in its history, to be quite honest. The late 80s were a boom time. The median family income rose by 15% by 1989. Sales and services shot up. 5 million new businesses were created. 20 million new jobs were created. Unemployment fell to 5.5% in 1988, the lowest in 14 years, the lowest since the mid-70s, right? So it appears that Ronald Reagan had done his promise. I do want to point out, I jumped ahead, I apologize. Before we get to 1984, Ronald Reagan also tried to bring his outlook to the court system. Ronald Reagan is what we call a strict constructionist. What that means is Ronald Reagan wanted judges who followed the original intent of the Constitution rather than taking loose interpretation of the wording, right? One thing about the Constitution, you guys should have noticed over the course of the year, is there are gray areas. And those gray areas allow a lot of flexibility. And Ronald Reagan was one of those people who's like, no, we're not going to take the fact we've got wiggle room and do whatever we want. We're going to ask ourselves, what did the founders want? What did they think?
and then we're going to try and do what they wanted. He promised that he would give us judges on the federal court system that felt that way. He appointed the first female judge to the U.S. Supreme Court, Miss Sandra Day O'Connor. In 1986, when Nixon's appointee, Chief Justice Warren Burger, retired, Reagan chose the most conservative of the associate justices, William Rehnquist, to succeed him. And to fill that vacancy, he named Antonin Scalia, a conservative. Um, and I really want to take a quick moment to point out this is why the Supreme Court matters. I was 6 years old when, actually, I wasn't six, I was 5 years old when Antonin Scalia took his seat on the United States Supreme Court, right? It's five. And I was 34 when he died, I believe, or maybe 35. That goes to show you the length of time in which Antonin Scalia influenced decision, law, and policy in this country. Far longer than any president could by law, right? You're president for a maximum of 10 years. And that is a whole lot of dice have to roll your way. Antonin Scalia was a Supreme Court judge for 30 years, roughly, right? So that is why people freak out about those appointments. In 1987, I do want to point out Ronald Reagan nominated Robert Bork to the court, and it led to a bitter fight. Liberals argued Bork was too extreme. They managed to block his confirmation of the court. I want to point out Robert Bork was involved with the Richard Nixon Saturday Night Massacres. In his stead, Ronald Reagan named Anthony Kennedy, a more moderate judge, to the Supreme Court. And Anthony Kennedy actually just recently resigned or stepped down from the court. So Ronald Reagan named strict constructionists to the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary in general, right? Trying to change the face of the federal court system. Now, in 1984, a growing economy made Ronald Reagan a juggernaut. The Democrats nominated Jimmy Carter's Vice President, Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale made some history. He nominated or chose as his vice presidential candidate the first female, the first woman to be chosen to be a vice presidential candidate for a major political party, Miss Geraldine Ferraro. Ronald Reagan didn't bother talking about either of these folks. Ronald Reagan focused on the booming economy. Because if you look at history, booming economies equal election wins. I do want to point out that in their first debate, Ronald Reagan seemed to off his game. And you have to realize at this point, Ronald Reagan was the oldest man to ever be president at that time, right? And there were concerns that Ronald Reagan was just too old, right? And he was slipping. And he was facing some of the issues that some elderly folks do. And in the second debate, one of the very first questions brought up in the debate, one of the moderators or questioners at the debate basically challenged Ronald Reagan about this issue and his age and such. And it is a golden Reagan moment because Reagan looked at that guy and without missing a beat said something, and I'm going to paraphrase along the lines of, I don't want to talk about this. I think it's very inappropriate for us to be discussing age at such a time like this, in such a manner like this. I don't think it's fair that we make fun of my opponent for his lack of experience and wisdom, in matters. I don't want his youth and inexperience to be an issue in this campaign. Everyone laughed, including Walter Mondale. And Walter Mondale had to laugh. His choice was laugh or cry, because at that moment, Ronald Reagan slammed the door on him. I mean, this guy basically called Ronald Reagan out and said, "You're too old to be president. How do you react to that?" And I am not kidding. Without missing a beat, Ronald Reagan immediately fired back with the ultimate comeback. He didn't even address his age. He addressed the fact of, I'm tired of you picking on my opponent for being too young for this job. That's not fair. Give the kid a chance. You know, You want to argue the guy who's got dementia or he's senile or he can't handle it, he's not sharp. He just showed you he's sharp as a tack, right? Ronald Reagan destroyed Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale got 13 electoral votes. He got D.C. You really can't tell, but he got D.C. in his home state of Minnesota. Ronald Reagan won 59% of the popular vote in every single electoral vote except for D.C. and Minnesota. It is the biggest win in electoral college history. It's a tie in a way because I know in 1972, Richard Nixon also got 49 of the 50 states, and his opponent got one state in D.C., but his opponent got Massachusetts, which was worth more. So if you want to go by sheer volume of electoral college votes, Ronald Reagan wins. County by county, it wasn't even close. Like most states were so Ronald Reagan, it hurts, right? It wasn't even a. It wasn't even. Here's how I like to point it out in class. Okay, Ronald Reagan won every single county in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's see, 6, 7, 8, 9 states. 9 states, he won every single county. And I know some of you are like, wait a minute. Nope, nope. He didn't get one county. He got every county but one. Every county but one. Okay? And there's a couple up in the UP. Every county but one. He didn't get Gary, Indiana. Right? I mean, look at that map though. I mean, look at that. He got Cincinnati. He got Columbus. He didn't get Cleveland, but he got basically all of Michigan except Detroit and like I don't know who lives here. You know, he got all of Illinois except for Chicago and the suburbs of St. Louis. He even got St. Louis, so it's kind of weird. I mean, you start looking at this map, and for those of you who are like, oh, California, it's nothing but West Coast liberals. Not in 1984, it wasn't, right? Look at the East Coast, right? I mean, Ronald Reagan did work. It's impressive. Um, and just to show you too, because I know some of you are like 1980. He won pretty big in 1980. Yeah, but look, Jimmy Carter won a few states. Jimmy Carter won a few. And here's where I like to kind of point out. 1980 and 1984. Look what that's why you can't just look at states. That's why you can't just look at states, in my opinion, right? Because 1980 looks like such a walk off as well, right? Because again, people are going to be like, okay, he got that, that, and that. That's the only difference, really. Yeah, but then look at the counties, right? Compare the county by county. That goes to show you how much Ronald Reagan did. He flipped all of Eastern Texas. All of Eastern Texas. He flipped basically half of Arkansas, the northern portions of Mississippi. He flipped all of Georgia. He flipped western Tennessee. He flipped large portions of central Kentucky. All right. I mean, he even stole parts of Minnesota. That's the thing. Look at the counties. Those are the maps you need to look at, right? That's when people get misled or they don't understand what they're looking at. Look at Florida. He took the whole panhandle, northern Florida vote and flipped it in 4 years, right? And I bring this up because it gives me a chance to tie it into more modern politics. The difference between 2012 and 2016 is just a few counties. Really, honestly, in 2012, Barack Obama beat Mitt Romney decently. And then you look at the county by county and you realize what happened. Nothing really changed in here. Look at these maps. Not a lot changed here and here and here. Nothing changed really in Nevada. Nothing really changed in Arizona or New Mexico or Colorado, right? Nothing really changed here. What changed? Nothing changed in Texas. I mean, look at it. Some of the states are identical in how their counties voted. And then you go to this part of the country and you see Iowa. You see all these counties along the Mississippi River who peeled off and went from blue to red, right? Same thing in Wisconsin. All these counties that peeled off from blue to red, right? You work your way into the east, right? And you start looking and you're like, what's the difference? Ohio, a few counties up north and northeast go from blue to red, right? Same thing with Michigan. See that little band? That little band right there? That's what did it. That little band is what gave Donald Trump a few thousand votes ahead of Hillary Clinton. Okay? In Maine, I know Maine's not a lot to talk about, but every vote, every electoral college vote counts. That'll win you one. And so that's the game that they have to play, right? That's what you got to do to win. That's what changes here. Here's 2012 and 2016. And there's the difference. That is a Democratic victory. Again, same. Here you go. No change, no change, basically no change, right? Up here. And I don't even care about that one vote in Maine, right? Here's what you change. You flip Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida. And how do you flip them? You don't flip the whole state. You flip a handful of counties, right? You don't even flip a handful of counties. You get better voter turnout or something. You flip a county here or there, a county here or there. You can do it, right? The margin of error is very thin. And I've showed you guys these previously. But Ronald Reagan's 1980 and 1984, I don't think any president has been that thorough in his beatdown of his opponents. Even in 1932, FDR, and then FDR's 1936 reelection. But FDR's third election was less resounding than his second, and his fourth was his closest one. So Ronald Reagan and FDR are kind of tied for the most thorough beatings of their opponents ever. And I would argue, like I've done many times, I don't even know if I'd count FDR because Great Depression, I don't think it's fair. I really don't. That's apples and oranges, right? But you can't find me another guy who so thoroughly just destroyed his opponents back to back, right, as Ronald Reagan did. And again, that shows you the rise of conservatism, right? Now, Ronald Reagan, one of his big things was building up the United States military, okay? Ronald Reagan was famous for his phrase, peace through strength. And that somewhat ties into, when we talked about it in the Cold War, I briefly touched upon it. My father served in Strategic Air Command, and the motto for Strategic Air Command was, peace is our profession. And some people are like, no, their profession was nuclear war. Exactly, right? Nobody messes with the people who play with nuclear bombs. And that was kind of their stance. We keep the global peace because people are scared of us. Ronald Reagan kind of took that stance. He said, look, you want to keep the Soviets in check? It's not through détente. It's not through negotiation. It's through standing up to them, right? And making them scared to make a move. And so Reagan, did a massive buildup of the United States military. As I mentioned, he was a big believer in, the 600 ship Navy. He spent about $1.5 trillion in a 5-year period. Let's just go with that number. He spent $1.5 trillion in 5 years on defense spending, which I'm pretty sure, accounting for inflation, is more than we spent on defense, like, in the whole 1960s. Like, Ronald Reagan spent a ton on defense. And he believed, and this is one of those things I don't know if history's ever going to know, but there's this argument that Ronald Reagan's advisors had a plan. We were going to spend the Soviets into bankruptcy, right? We knew the Soviets could not keep up, and we were going to force them to spend money they didn't have. And unlike us, they couldn't afford debt. And we were going to build and build and build, and they were going to try and keep up, and it was going to destroy them economically. In 1982, Ronald Reagan spoke at his old college, Eureka, and he talked that massive defense spending by the Soviets would cause them to collapse. He said, the Soviet empire is faltering because rigid centralized control has destroyed incentives for innovation, efficiency, and individual achievement. But in the midst of social and economic problems, the Soviet dictatorship has forged the largest armed force in the world. It's done so by preempting the human needs of its people, and in the end, this course will undermine the foundations of the Soviet system. Ronald Reagan took what George Kennan said all those years ago in the long telegram about we'll wait for the Soviets to collapse, and Ronald Reagan supposedly understood the Soviets needed a little push. They were they had their toes on the cliff, right? And Ronald Reagan's advisor said, dude, military spending is the push that'll throw them off the cliff, right? And so he started it. Now, that created massive deficit. That created massive debt. No lie. We already looked at that, so I'm not gonna harp on that. But he sent the American deficit and debt through the roof, right? Deficit is every year how much debt you rack up. Debt is your total amount you owe. He racked it up. It wasn't just on military spending. It wasn't just building up America's military. Reagan announced what's called the Reagan Doctrine. And I call it the reverse of the Truman Doctrine. If you remember the Truman Doctrine was the United States government pledged to help any legitimate government fight off communist insurgents. Ronald Reagan created what's called the Reagan Doctrine, which was basically the United States would help any group wanting to overthrow a communist government. Right? So Truman said, I'll help governments fight off communism. Reagan said, I will help guerrilla or revolutionary groups try and topple commie governments. For example, Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a pro-Soviet government that was there. The Soviets soon found themselves bogged down in a guerrilla war fighting the Mujahideen, which was the term taken by the Afghanistan resistance, or Afghani resistance. Jimmy Carter sent about $30 million in military aid to the Afghans, but Ronald Reagan would eventually send $570 million more in aid. He sent some of the most advanced anti-aircraft weapons so they could shoot down helicopters. He sent them medicine, equipment, CIA operatives to train them, everything. He turned Afghanistan into Russia's Vietnam. The more troops Russia poured into Afghanistan, the harder the fighting, the more the guerrillas fought back, the more equipment we gave them. I mean, it was really like Vietnam. The Russians found themselves where they couldn't win the countryside because we were encouraging the rebellion in the countryside. Eventually, the Russians had to accept they couldn't win. Casualties mounted. It strained their economy. And in 1988, the Russians withdrew from Afghanistan. Right? We did it. There are, of course, side effects. I don't want to get into it too much. But basically, we paved the way for the power vacuum and chaos in Afghanistan that would eventually lead to the rise of a group called the Taliban. And the Taliban would eventually provide safe haven to a little guy known as Osama bin Laden. So you win some, you lose some. Ronald Reagan, also closer to home, supported a revolution in Nicaragua. A group of rebels known as the Sandinistas um, eventually took power and overthrew the pro-American dictator of Nicaragua in 1979. And I want to emphasize, pro-American dictator. So there was a dictator. He was basically a fascist, but he wasn't a communist, so we let him get away with it. He was overthrown by his own people in 1979. The Sandinistas took power. They were pro-communist. They had deals with the Cubans and the Soviets. They began supporting guerrillas in El Salvador. And Ronald Reagan's government began supporting the rebels who fought the Sandinistas, known as the Contras, which was from the Spanish word for contra-revolutionary. Now, there is a whole story about this. Um, but eventually Congress said you can't support the Contras because we found out that one of the ways the Contras made their money was through drug smuggling, and so we weren't allowed to support them. And there's going to be a whole to-do about the Iran Contras. We'll get there in a moment. Okay. Um, in 1983, Marxists overthrew the government of the small island of Grenada in the Caribbean. In October of 1983, Ronald Reagan sent American troops to prevent this communist takeover of this small Caribbean island, kind of showing we are not going to even hesitate to deal with communism in our hemisphere. Now, going back to Nicaragua, Congress had very clearly said you could not support the rebels. But individuals in the Reagan administration found a bit of a loophole. It's not even a loophole. What they did is, so hang on. Yeah, so I just summarized it up here. This is something I usually do on the whiteboard. I realized I didn't have a slide for it. So what happened was members of the Reagan administration decided to quietly sell weapons to the Iranians. Yes, the same Iranians who took our people hostage at the embassy, the same Iranians who hate us. By this point, the 1980s, Iran is bogged down in a huge war with their neighbor Iran, or excuse me, Iraq. The Iraq-Iran war is a topic most Americans know little about. It was one of the worst conflicts of the 20th century. No kidding. It involved chemical weapons. It involved mass human wave attacks that we hadn't seen since World War One. It was horrible. Um, Anyhow, Iran was in the midst of a brutal conflict with Iraq. And because Iran had a lot of weapons from their old days of being under the Shah, who was America's friend, they had a lot of American equipment. They needed replacement parts, right? All these American fighter planes and helicopters, they need replacement parts to keep those things running. America had embargoed Iran from the very beginning. So America offered to sell these people replacement parts, weapons, missiles on the down low, right? Quietly. In return, the Iranians were not only going to use those weapons to kill the Iraqis, they were going to use their influence in the Middle East to release American hostages. During the 1980s, a number of American missionaries, aid workers, journalists were taken hostage in places like Lebanon and Syria and such by various groups like Hezbollah and other groups that are considered terrorists. And basically, members of the Iranian government said, "We'll get your people released, okay, if you provide us weapons to fight our war against Iraq." Right? So we did it. We sold weapons to our enemy, Iran, and in return, Iran was going to do us a solid. Right? So we got all this money that Congress didn't know about because Congress wouldn't have allowed us to sell. Again, we're doing this illegally. We're illegally selling weapons to Iran. So we've got illegal money on our hands. Members of the Reagan administration said we would then funnel that money to the Contras. Like, what else are we going to do with it? It's illegal money. Let's get rid of it. So we're going to send it to the Contras. Again, in direct violation of Congress. Everything broke loose in November of 1986. One of the big people in it was National Security Council advisor Oliver North, a Marine colonel. Um, he and a few other people testified before Congress and admitted they were part of a cover-up. They shredded documents. They did this. They did that. They kind of took the hit. I remember this as a kid vaguely. I remember seeing Oliver North on TV testifying. Um, I do want to say that President Reagan said that he knew about the weapon sales. He fully knew about this. He said, "I knew this. I didn't know what happened with the money, and I had no idea that we did this." And Ronald Reagan said, "Look, I did it to try and save American lives. I knew that I was not doing necessarily right, but please understand, I was trying to save American lives in the Middle East." In the end, nobody was able to prove that Ronald Reagan knew about the Contra connection. It did tarnish his reputation his second term. As part of Ronald Reagan's military buildup, by the way, though, peace through strength. Um, he said we're going to redeploy short-range nuclear missiles into Eastern Europe, for example. He said I'm sick of all these talks of removals and limiting arsenals, etc., because the Russians don't follow them. So we're going to play, we're going to play their game. Um, he said, well, we're going to put missiles in in our European allies, and we'll remove them only if the Soviets remove their missiles from their allies in Eastern Europe. Ronald Reagan proposed a whole new round of talks called the START talks, the Strategic Arms Reduction talks, where he talked about cutting the number of nuclear weapons in half. The Soviets walked out on the talks, right? So Ronald Reagan did what many historians have looked at and laughed at, and I even like to make fun of it just because it's crazy. He proposed what's called the Strategic Defense Initiative. See, Ronald Reagan looked at America's nuclear policy and said it's crazy. Massive retaliation is crazy because it's a reactive policy. It is not going to protect Americans from an actual attack. It's supposed to prevent an attack. What if the Russians just attack? What if they just say, yeah, forget it, and they roll the dice? What's going to save us? Nothing. We all die. And Ronald Reagan looked at that and said, well, that's a terrible game plan. There's like no plan B, right? There's nothing to actually save us from an attack. We're just praying there is no attack. So Ronald Reagan proposed designing a way to prevent or stop a Soviet attack. Strategic Defense Initiative. The press called it Star Wars, making fun of it for being some science fiction thing. Because he talked about satellites with lasers and interception missiles and this satellite called Brilliant Pebbles that would basically create a cloud of like grenades in space that Soviet missiles would have to fly through, and reflecting laser beams shot from space into brilliant eye satellites that would reflect them and target. Oh my goodness, so many things. We spent so much money, right? Now, there is none of this ever came to fruition, if you're curious. None of this was ever possible. The idea of being able to stop a nuclear attack is crazy. It's not possible. Because it's not like you got to shoot down one, you got to shoot down hundreds. If there's a nuclear war, the Russians are going to fire several hundred missiles. And they're not all going to be long range ICBMs. Some will be fired from nuclear submarines right off the coast. Well, theoretically, right? You're going to have all kinds of missiles coming in from all kinds of angles and speeds. You're going to have decoys. You're going to have multiple independent reentry vehicles and MIRVs. You're going to have all kinds of stuff, right? It's not like, you mean we can't shoot down a missile? We can shoot down a missile. I'm not going to doubt that. I'm pretty sure our government can shoot down a missile. Like if North Korea snaps and fires a nuclear missile our way, I think we might be able to handle it. Your problem is Russia's not going to fire one. They're going to fire 100. They're going to fire 1,000. They're going to turn the key and fire everything. And we would too, right? I mean, that's how the game is played. It's use it or lose it. And so this was never possible. There are several other problems with Star Wars that I'll cover very quickly. No one's going to sit back and watch this happen. You can't put this in space overnight, right? There's no way to get a nuclear shield in space overnight. It's going to take years to launch hundreds of satellites and test weapon systems. You think the Russians are going to sit there and watch their entire nuclear arsenal be rendered useless? The theory is that SDI would actually force the Soviets to launch nuclear weapons in fear of becoming basically helpless against the United States. So there's a lot of issues with it. There is the argument, though, that Reagan never intended it to work. What he intended to do? Make the Russians try and copy us. Because America can afford to spend money on this garbage. The Russians don't have the cash for this. And the theory is Ronald Reagan was simply trying to bankrupt the Soviets by convincing them they needed to build this nuclear shield like we were building. Regardless, in 1985, the Soviet Union got a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to meet with Ronald Reagan to talk about nuclear arms control. Ronald Reagan understood that, Mikhail Gorbachev understood that without change, the Soviet Union would collapse. That economically and politically, the Soviet Union could not keep going the way she was. They had a series of summits, and at first, they were not productive. Um, Gorbachev actually promised to cut back the number of Russian nuclear forces if Ronald Reagan would give up SDI, but Reagan refused. Reagan famously challenged Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall, famously saying, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, tear down this wall. By 1987, they had productive meetings, and Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. Um, in December of 1987, the two leaders signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. It was the first call to actually remove, not set future limits, but to actually reduce the existing nuclear arsenals. It was the first time we actually scaled back our nuclear arsenals, both of us. No one realized this was the beginning of the end, but it was. Mikhail Gorbachev, feeling like he had avoided a nuclear war with America, began instituting various political and economic reforms which would eventually destroy the Soviet Union. But that's a story for another history class. Ronald Reagan left office in late 1980, actually early 1989. Um, Ronald Reagan liked to talk about how he put America back on course. He was a fairly humble man about it. He said, they called it the Reagan Revolution. I'll accept that, but for me, it always seemed more like a great rediscovery, a rediscovery of our values and our common sense. And thus will end your American history class, gentlemen. Thank you.